Anyway, we're going to talk about design arguments for the existence of God, two of them specifically. And when talking about design, it's really when there is a purpose behind an object or phenomenon. So it's not just randomly put into existence, but there's actually a thought behind it. And a thought is usually being thinked by intelligent beings. So obviously the Christian message is that the universe, everything that exists, is created and therefore designed by God. And there's a scripture that points to how we, just by observing the things around us, might know that God exists and that God is powerful, that He is able to bring all of the stars and planets and animals and plants into being, right? For example, in Psalm 19, and the Bible says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech, night after night they display knowledge." And there are indeed a lot of people who have just looked at creation and realized that there is a God. One of my favorite authors called John Wimber, an American, and he realized that God exists when he went out into the American desert and sat down and watched the sunrise. And then he realized that there is a God. Yeah. So yeah, and basically there's obviously been a lot of debate during the last, I would say, 100 years concerning the origin of life. And there's been a debate about whether it's evolution or if God created all the animals as they are. And I'm not going to dig into that debate, because I think that there are good arguments for the universe and the earth being designed by God, even if you accept evolution, which actually a lot of Christians do. So yeah, I will basically argue that there is a purpose behind what we see around us, both on the macro and micro level. The macro being, the ground scale, all of space. And micro, then we'll look at something very, very small, namely DNA. But let's start with the macro one, all right? And then I'll talk about the fine tuning of the universe and a little planet to illustrate that. All right. So basically, what scientists have found is obviously, and this is not something that just scientists have found, that the universe is very complex. It's very, very complicated. There are a lot of things going on. But not only that, you can change the laws of nature and realize that life wouldn't be able to exist anyway. And this is something that has confused a lot of scientists during just the last 50 years, when they have discovered that, for example, if you change gravity, so you make gravity a little bit stronger or a little bit more lighter in all of the universe, then actually life wouldn't exist anywhere. So not only would life be impossible here on Earth, but life wouldn't be possible anywhere. And this is to a very, very little degree. So basically, if you take 1 and divide it with a number which is 1 and then 60 zeros after it, and you apply that to the laws of nature, then life wouldn't exist anywhere. And there are also other kinds of these constants, as physicists call them. One, for example, called the cosmological constant. If you change that by a number which is basically a one 120 zeros after it, then life wouldn't exist anywhere in the universe, and there wouldn't even be stars to begin with. Now, that is a massive number. For comparison, if you take the number of atoms in the universe, you have a number which is 1 and then 80 zeros after it. So basically what we're talking about is this incredible fine-tuning of the universe. Now, this is a problem for those who say that there is no God, because they have to say that there's no purpose behind the universe, there's no design, there's no thought, it just, came into being randomly, and it has evolved randomly, and, it's just molecules bumping into each other without any plan. They can't really explain this fine-tuning, because it's not that these constants are necessary. You could easily imagine a universe that was different, but if you say that it's just because of chance, it's just because of this, this happened randomly, then you realize that the probability of that being the case is so extremely small that it's basically ridiculous. It's a greater possibility that you shoot a little laser up in the night sky and then it goes through the universe for years and years and years and hit a little alien ant on another planet. It's this incredible unlikeliness. And that really points to the fact that it's very reasonable to say that the universe is created and that God is behind it. All right? The second example is a micro example about DNA and the origin of life. Now, DNA is fascinating. I'm sure you've all heard of it. These strings inside all cells basically map, how we are to function. And there's a lot of them. So in 1 gram of DNA, there is approximately 700 terabytes of information. And that's a lot. My computer has 1 terabyte storage capacity. So, yeah, that's... yeah. And obviously a human body, it weighs more than 1 gram. So, scientists predict that in a normal human body, there's about 150 trillion gigabytes of information in all of the DNA, which is very, very much. All right. Yeah. So we have this incredible complexity, and again, most atheists will say, well, it just evolved. Usually evolution, so you have these more simpler species, and then they get children, and eventually you'll end up with a human being who's more complex. The problem is, though, even if you look at the very, very most basic life forms, the most simple bacteria or cell you can find, it's still very complex. So basically, DNA is complicated, and for that to, for that to originate randomly, also is this incredible coincidence, if that's the case. And the probability of that is so small that it's much more probable to say, no, actually, God created life, and God created the information that's in our DNA. There was an atheist in this country called Antony Flew. Has anyone heard of him?
Yeah, philosopher.
Yeah, he was a philosopher, and he was an atheist most of his life, but then in 2004, in an interview, he actually said, well, I've looked at the evidence and I think that there is intelligence behind the universe. There is an intelligent cause for life, right? Wow. And later on, 3 years later, he published a book called There Is a God, where he described how he changed his position. And his main argument for this was DNA and it being so complex that he couldn't imagine that this is just due to chance. Wherever we find something as complex and fine-tuned, we usually say that it's it has been brought forth with a thought behind it. So, for example, say that you're walking in the jungle somewhere in the Amazon, and then you find a big city, right? So there's a lot of houses, and there's writing on the houses, and different forms of houses used for different functions. Some are storage houses, some are houses that are suitable for living in, and so on. You would assume that these are the artifacts of an ancient civilization, that people have actually lived in this city and constructed that city. But that doesn't have to be the case. I mean, logically, it's possible that these were just some mountains once, and then there were a couple of earthquakes and some rain, and then it randomly constructed this city. But the probability of there being an intelligence and a design behind this city is much more likely, right? And I think, didn't I tell somebody about, I think I told you about the British Railways example in Wales. I think I did, because you come from Wales. Yeah. Yeah. No worries.
Sorry, it's not that you're boring me at all. Do you know what it is? I'm just so relaxed here.
Yeah. No problem at all.
I am listening to you.
Yeah.
It's like when my other half always says to me, like, about turning the telly off, like, because you're not watching it. I'm listening to it.
It's all right. You just carry on feeling relaxed.
Yeah.
If you want to sleep, I do feel relaxed. That's not a good sign, isn't it? I do feel relaxed here. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I do apologise. I'm not falling asleep.
No. It's perfectly fine.
Just look at the back of my eye.
Yeah. It's great. Now, imagine that you're traveling with a train to Wales, all right? And there's a hill outside the window where there are a couple of rocks, and they say British Railways welcomes you to Wales, all right? So then most of you would assume that there have been a couple of employees of British Railways that have put a bunch of rocks on that hill, because they know that people would go with British Railways and the trains to Wales, and they will see that and they will be happy. But that doesn't have to be the case. I mean, it could be the case that these rocks randomly just fell there over a couple of 100,000 of years, and then randomly they were put in this sequence, which for us looks like a message in English. That's possible, but it is improbable. It's much more probable that there is design behind these. And furthermore, it's not really possible to speak about information or a message if the fact is that these rocks have just randomly been put there. Because a message needs a source. and if there wasn't anyone behind this, then there is no message there. It's just a coincidence. It just appears to be a message, even though it's not. It's only possible to speak about message or this kind of information when there is design behind it. So there's also a famous example by actually an atheist who is called Fred Hoyle. He was an atheist who believed that that life couldn't have spontaneously come up on Earth. But since he didn't have God to refer to, he said that life probably came from outer space. So we're all aliens, and somehow there was life that came here. And he didn't attempt answering where that life came from. But he said that it is so unlikely that life just originates from natural processes, He said that, the likelihood of that being 1 divided by a 1 with 40,000 zeros, which is insanely unlikely. And he compared it to, if you imagine a junkyard, so you have a bunch of scraps and metallics and garbage, and then comes a tornado, whew, goes over that junkyard, and when the tornado has left, there's an airplane there, fully functional, with gasoline in its tank. He said that's the likeliness of life just popping into being, and that's why it's actually very reasonable to say that there is a God. So when people say to me, there's no evidence for God's existence, then this is one of the arguments I use. And sometimes I talk about my phone, and I say, when you see this phone, do you think it was manufactured and there was a plan behind it? Or do you think that I just found it in the forest and it was, the effect or the product of millions of years of random metals being mushed together in a volcano? And obviously most of them will say no, it's actually manufactured in China, right? Also when people say that there's no purpose with anything, there's no plan, where we're just here and there's no reason behind it, this is actually very encouraging. This is, an example of when science actually really shows the way to God, which made even an atheist willing in the end of his life to say, no, there is an intelligent cause behind the universe. All right, let's move to questions.